detailing all the proceedings of the rectilineator experiment. The location of the Crescent Geodetic Survey was over a straight patch of sand on Naples Beach, Florida, minutes from the Crescent commune. The rectilineator experiment, invented by Morrow, was a geniusly simple apparatus consisting of giant 12-foot sectioned T-squares lining up together in a leapfrog procession over a long distance to form a perfectly straight air line. If done accurately, it would determine the direction of the curvature of the Earth, if any. In other words, if the initially leveled airline would continually rise the further down it went, the Earth would prove to be convex, just like the Copernican system proclaims. If the line continued at the same height, the Earth would be proven to be flat. And if the airline would show a continual descent from the initial station, the Earth would be proven to be concave. This test of the curvature of the Earth subverts any attempts by long-distance lasers or telescopic surveys. Although these other tests are good methods to determine Earth is not convex, the rectilineator has the advantage of forcing the line, by a mechanical process, to stay rigid throughout the survey. It doesn't allow the varying bending of light, which has been proven to fluctuate throughout the day. Because of Florida's ever-rising water levels over the past 118 years since the survey, and because Naples Beach is a luxurious haven for the wealthy, the manicured beaches today look slightly different than from the line illustrations that the Crescents provided. The survey started at the still-standing Naples Pier and extended southward for 4 1/8 of a mile. 2 3/8 of those miles were measured with the rectilineator apparatus, and the remaining 1 3/4 of a mile were surveyed by line-of-sight telescope. There's a break in the beach called Gordon Pass, and directly behind the pass is a sandbar that needed to be excavated, or scooped out in order for the descending airline to pass through the sandbar and shoot the water at 4 1/8 of a mile, where a sailboat was cast off to be used as a reference point of the termination of the projected airline into the water. The preparations before the survey could actually begin were tedious and time-consuming. A full 2 months of the complete 5-month-long project involved 1. Conducting an initial coast survey with surveyor's instruments, which involved erecting a series of stakes on the beach along the water, equally spaced at 1/8 of a mile apart, creating a 4 1/2 mile long meridian line extending north to south. These stakes were to be used as reference points for the rectilineator, but also set the locations for the caissons, which I'll get into soon. 2. Mild land excavation was necessary. The shoreline's elevation varies from about 5 feet at the pier to around 3 feet near the pass. But this proved to be a blessing for Morrow and the Crescents. Let me explain. Since the vertical standards of the apparatus were only 8 feet tall, and the calculated amount of deviation after 2 3/8 of a mile was over 48 inches, the apparatus would have had to start a good 2 feet higher than it actually did if the beach was level in elevation. But since the beach made a nice gradual 2-foot decline toward the south, Morrow could keep his beams at a comfortable height throughout the entire survey. Hence, the excavation could be simplified by simply smoothing out any small mounds of sand in the line and removing any debris. 3. 4 weeks were devoted to testing and adjusting right angles. According to Morrow, 6 series of tests were applied, and each section was reversed, end for end, and turned over 50 times on the special platform with the mechanical devices for measurement and reference. Points and the finest possible lines engraved on steel and brass plates, to which adjustments were referred, were read by means of the microscope. In this way, the very slightest variation of angles could be detected. And 4. A series of tide registers would have to be erected in the water to find a consistent datum line. Now, to compensate for the varying tidal waters, Morrow used perforated caissons, which allowed water in through small holes at the bottom. Attached to the caissons were tide staffs. The caissons stabilized the wavy water, which allowed accurate and consistent readings. Morrow states, the average of the tide levels on the Florida coast is about 3.5 feet. The mean tide level is a point midway between high and low tide levels. It was necessary to ascertain this point with all possible precision, which we did by means of a tide register, consisting of a caisson with perforations and a tide staff measure, set in the Gulf, so that its bottom was below the level of low tide and its top above the level of high tide. The perforations emitted the water from beneath at normal pressure and prevented wave fluctuations. Thus, the water in the caisson was perfectly still and only rose and fell with the Gulf tide level. When the mean tide level was obtained, it was marked upon the stationary tide register and became the fixed point to which all other measurements of water level were referred. The vertical tide staff connected to the tide register on the caisson was used to project a datum line exactly 128 inches above mean tide level. Then the geodetic level was used to transfer an exact perpendicular line over to the corresponding stake on the beach. Since the mean tide level in the first stationary tide register became a known and fixed quantity, it was taken as the basis of reference for the measure of the airline at all station points along the line. To illustrate this process, we have the staffs on both the initial station register and any given portable register along the line. Line XY is the mean tide level, which is marked as a fixed point on staff A, the top of which is the altitude of 128 inches above mean tide level, which also is transferred to the beach. They were then easily to record the same vertical altitude regardless of the fluctuating tides. Here's how. Say they were reading for a portable tide measurement 2 miles down, and the reading on the tide staff A is 12 inches above the mean tide level, leaving 116 inches of the staff sticking above the water. The line PQ is our 116-inch line. Now on staff B, they simply adjust its height to reach precisely 116 inches above the waterline in the corresponding portable caisson. This was done instantaneously with Morse code, so the reading was perfectly accurate. In this way, no matter whether the measurements were taken at high tide or low tide, or at any water level between the two extremes, the results were accurate, because the fixed point at staff A was the constant and unvarying basis of reference. Finally, when the vertical altitude of staff B was ascertained, the corresponding vertical angle was transferred to the land elevation. There were 25 tide registers in all, spaced 1/8 of a mile apart from the beginning to the end of the line, which when completed formed a line that was parallel to the water's surface. This hypsometric principle of ascertaining tidal secondary datum lines, as opposed to the first being underwater at times, was scientific and accurate. But in order for this survey to function well, the initial section had to be perfectly level, for if it leaned either up or down, even the slightest, it would give an inaccurate reading down the line later. That's why so much time and redundant measures of scrutiny were taken to make sure the first beam was perfectly level. Morrow used the finest and most sensitive spirit levels obtainable. He also hung a plumb line over each side crossarm, and he created a custom-made 12-foot-long mercurial level with fine-tuned accuracy. All three leveling procedures had to be in agreement with each other in order for the first section to be considered perfectly level. He also telescopically viewed the horizon as further corroboration and found it to be perfectly parallel with the clear-cut waterline of the Gulf. According to Morrow, the leveling was a careful, painstaking, successful work witnessed by every member of the staff, and finally pronounced perfect at 8:50 on the morning of March 18, 1897. Because of the poor quality and the scant amount of photographs and illustrations of the mechanical part of the rectilineator, with some showing differences in appearance, it was difficult to precisely reconstruct it in 3D without taking some liberties of guesswork. But here's my version. Morrow states that the rectilineator consisted of a number of sections in the form of double T-squares, each 12 feet in length with braced and tensioned crossarms 4 feet in length. The material was 1-inch mahogany, seasoned for 12 years in the shops of the Pullman Palace Car Company from Chicago. The horizontal bar was 8 inches in width and the crossarms 5 inches. He used steel tension rods marking an X across the entire section and extending through the extremities of the crossarms. They were adjusted to maintain the constancy of right angles. Finely trimmed brass facings at the extremities of the crossarms constituted the adjusting surfaces. Through flanges in the facing, ingenious screws were placed for securing the adjustments when made. Each section was supported by 2 strongly built, platformed standards, with adjustable castings to receive the horizontal sections between the body of the castings and adjustable cleats with clamps and set screws. The beams rested in the casting edgewise. The principle involved in its operation was as simple as the placing of 2 rectangular plates in contact, or laying 2 mechanics squares together. From the first to the last of the 1045 adjusted sections, the same procedure was methodically performed. 2 standards were placed in front of the previous adjusted section and placing the castings at the approximate height. The new section was placed in position in the castings. Initially, they turned the set screws to raise or lower the horizontal axis to approximately the height of one of the middle brass lines of the previous beam. The brass facings were then brought to 1/4 of an inch of contact. Operators of the set screws were directed to raise or lower the section to bring the hairlines exactly coincidental. Fine lines were read with the microscope, and the section was carefully moved horizontally by 2 set screw operators turning each screw in unison as the facings get to 1/50th of an inch apart. Then a Bristol card is placed between each facing with equal friction to ensure exact spacing. When the same card passes through each facing top and bottom with equal friction, it proves that the adjustment is precise. Then finally, the 2 sections are bolted together at the 2 brass facings, top and bottom, with equal torque, and the procedure is repeated. They had watchmen guarding the apparatus continually throughout each night to ensure no one tampered with it. As expected, because measuring the curvature of the Earth will happen in a logarithmic fashion, increasing exponentially toward the end of the survey, there wasn't any detectable deviation for the first few sections. But after that, it was a done deal. As soon as the airline showed consistent deviation in the descent, the sign of curvature of the Earth already could be determined. And it was, of course, concave. What still needed to be determined was if the amount of descent was consistent with the circumference of the Earth, and it was. After 1 mile, it measured 8.02 inches, only 2/100ths of an inch away from an even 8 inches. That, my friends, is the work of a genius. After 2 miles, it was still fairly close, 30.62 inches to the generally agreed 32 inches. And at the end of the survey, at 2 3/8 of a mile, the descent was 48.25 inches. At every 12th adjustment, the spirit level was read. If the bubble began to deviate to the south, the Earth would show to be convex, and if to the north, then concave. The bubble consistently rose to the north of the vial. The plumb line was also used, and hung over the 4-foot vertical crossbeams. In converse manner to the spirit level, if the bob shifted to the north, it would show convexity, but if to the south, then concavity. The plumb bob consistently shifted to the south again, further corroborating concavity. The 12-foot mercurial level would measure the angle of divergence within the length of the beam. This deviation would become more apparent at the end of the survey. Morrow also used the telescope to view the horizon from 15 feet behind the last section in the line. He noticed a continual sinking of the airline going below the horizon, which further proved the Earth was curving upward. There were 3 main measurements when all 4 of these appurtenances were used, one at 1 mile, one at 2 miles, and one at 2 3/8 of a mile. The results all agree in testimony of concavity. The remaining line of sight phase of the survey proved to show a fairly expected amount of descent as the airline passed through the excavated sandbar after Gordon passed to finally hit the water's surface. Morrow placed a steel horizontal strip at the height of the last recorded measurement protruding from stake 20 at the 2 3/8 mile mark, then moved back his telescope to stake 19, 1/8 of a mile away, where the heights of both markers were aligned to point through the excavated sandbar and wait for the bottom of the hull of the sailboat to line up. Through signaling, it was determined, and the crew on the boat calculated a 4 1/8 mile distance from the stationary tide register. The survey was complete and deemed a complete success. And the data speaks for itself. It wasn't tampered with. Even Simonek admits it appears genuine. And you begin to really see the lopsided victory for concavity when you take the numbers from the column distance of airline below secondary datum, or the amount in inches of deviation every 1/8 of a mile, and plot them on a graph. You see how accurately it matches the calculated amount of curvature to the Earth? It's truly a slam dunk victory, and a silent testimonial witness of the fact that you are living inside the spherical concave Earth. To think
Okay, I want to talk about the horizontal crease, I call it, within the concave Earth. Basically, back in the 1800s, there was a guy named Heinrich Himmel. No, I'm sorry. Okay, I want to talk about what I call the horizontal crease within the concave Earth. Back in the 1800s, there was a guy, a geodetist, named Heinrich Hohenner. Is that how you say it? Geodetist? A surveyor, basically. And he came up with this leveler experiment, where he attached this apparatus to a telescope, and he found out that the sunlight that is coming down to Earth is actually bending up, back up toward the sky. So basically, if that is like your point of sun, your sunlight origin, your light is going to be coming down, it's going to be hitting the ocean or the land, and it's going to be reflecting back upward or curving back upward like that. So that's why we only see the top mass of samples at distances. Cyrus Teed also used that experiment to conduct his rectilineator experiment, which proved that the curvature of the Earth was actually concave, it was curving upward. And so now, in light of the fact that most of smart people realize that there's actually a glass sky at 100 kilometers, which is the Kármán line, you can understand that there's actually, as well as the leveler, which is causing the eye to deviate upwards, it's also flipping the celestial horizon. So there's two horizons basically. You got this verge here that Cyrus Teed called it. That's where your eye hits the horizon basically. Whatever altitude you're at, your eye is always going to hit the verge basically. But then it continues curving upward, and then you create this blind spot basically. So you don't see what's behind there up until it's met up again with the celestial orb, the objects in the celestial sky, whether it be the moon, the sun, or the stars. Then you see. So it's like a double horizon basically. So I created this horizon. This blue line is the actual horizon in which we see the sun rising after the verge. But then there's also a crease. I call it the horizontal crease, and that's usually below the horizon, I believe. However, sometimes it's revealed, like in Arctic regions, when you have a superior mirage or Fata Morgana, basically. And that's how you see some of these images here. Now let's say it's a layer, it's the different layers of temperature, ice crystals in the atmosphere that's creating this inversion. I think that might accentuate the fact that there's glass in the sky. That's actually, the glass is creating this inversion. So whenever you see that happening, or sometimes you see the sunset, looks like it's sinking and then it's rising up again, you're seeing the crease, you're seeing the horizontal crease. And so what I have here is, you have this red line being the crease, basically. So that's where the actual split occurs. And normally you don't see the crease, but during certain conditions, whether they be temperature related or regional related, like you only see them in the Arctic regions, that crease is being revealed over the horizon. And so that's where that crease happens. It's caused by the glass sky. And so you have the sun. This is the perceived direction of the sun. Then you have the actual direction of the sun. It's splitting at the crease. So you have your eye, you have the verge, the leveler experiment proved that your eye is deviating upward. Then you have this blind spot. Then it meets up again with the celestial horizon. So there's like this gap that you don't see, the blind spot. So that's how I perceive what's really going on. Why we don't see things the way they appear. We think that we're living on a convex planet, but we're not. We're actually living inside the Earth. So that's a trick of nature. It's caused by the command line and the ascending deviation of our eyes. We're always looking at a curve. We're looking at a curve, basically. So whatever altitude this eye you're at, you're always going to see the horizon with your eye level, the verge. But then there's going to be this gap. That gap would narrow if you're higher in altitude. So that's why also, like, if you're at higher altitude, you'll see the moon or the sun looks like even more squished like that, because it's being compressed optically by the glass sky. So it gets inverted again. So there's a crease here. There's the crease. It's also in sunset as well. Leveler experiments were conducted by Heinrich Hohenner, 1874 and 1966, proved that light bends upward when it strikes the Earth. Contrary to what is taught in optics, Wilhelm Martin reconducted the experiment in 2001 and reached the same conclusion. From the observer's viewpoint, as he looks across the land, his eye reaches the verge, which is always at eye level regardless of its altitude. Behind the verge is a blind spot that is concluded by the celestial orbs rising and setting in the distance. The glass sky creates an optical inversion to the heavens by refraction. This creates a horizontal crease that lies below the actual visual horizon of the celestial orbs. Thus, there are actually two horizons, the initial one created by the verge and the latter one seen past the verge on the celestial sphere. This horizontal crease, however, is sometimes visible in extreme polar regions in the case of superior mirages or fatamorganas. So there you go, guys. The horizontal crease. You heard it here first by Stephen Joseph Christopher, affectionately known as the Lord Savior Christ. The horizontal crease. That's what's really going on with superior mirages and fatamorganas. No sound? No sound? No sound? You can hear me. Thank you, thank you. Alright, cool. Sound is on now.
Referred to as the architecture of the universe, and even the fingerprint of God. Sacred geometry is found throughout the natural world. Indeed, it is all around us, an aspect of the true matrix, if you have the eye to see it. It is also one of the very few subjects which appeals to both left brain and right brain ways of thinking at the same time. It satisfies the left brain's desire for logical, sequential, and objective data, or to put it simply, looking at the parts. It also satisfies the right brain's desire for random, intuitive, and subjective data, the study of the whole. It is simply not possible to cover all aspects of sacred geometry. People have spent entire lifetimes contemplating just one aspect of sacred geometry, such as a rabbi studying the Kabbalistic tree of life. I will do my best to introduce you to the basics and hopefully inspire you to research further on your own. The only logical place to start is to show you how nature created its very first pattern. Nature can also be substituted with God or Spirit, whatever is your preferred term, it doesn't matter, as they are describing the same one reality that we all share. It is also interesting to note that Genesis in the Bible essentially describes the process I'm about to show you. However, it should be told that this wisdom was most likely taken from the ancient Egyptian mystery schools, and that it is not original to the Bible. In the beginning there was the void, and within this infinite void is the Spirit of God. This spirit has not manifested anything yet, so the Eye of Horus I'm using here to represent the Spirit of God is not a reality. In other words, essentially God and the void are one, but obviously I cannot show you God and the void as one, as they cannot be depicted graphically at the same time. That is the nature of emptiness. At this point, there are no dimensions or space, and there is no time. There is also only two options available for God. Remain in this state of static omnipresence or begin creating. God will begin creation eventually, however, as there is no time, it is irrelevant to ask how long it took to make the decision to begin creating reality. Okay, so now God has decided to begin creation. But before this can happen, God needs to create a canvas on which he is to paint his masterpiece. The first thing that God does is create the three dimensions. It does this by projecting a beam of consciousness from a single point in all 6 directions: front, back, left, right, up and down, in equal measure. Bear in mind that the void is infinite and that distance has not been defined yet, so it does not matter how far these beams are projected from the point, it makes no difference. You must also understand that what I'm showing here graphically is not a reality. That is, the structures being created are not material in any form. They are imaginary lines, they are pure consciousness. You may need to pause or replay this video several times before the implications become apparent to you. At this point, God is halfway to creating space. In order to complete this process, it must define some boundaries, because as I mentioned before, the void is infinite, and if no boundaries are defined, then relative movements of spirits remain impossible. To define some boundaries, all God needs to do is connect the end of every point to the end of every other point. The beauty of this, and indeed the entire process itself, is that God cannot make a mistake. It is simply impossible. Once all the ends are connected, what we have is an octahedron, which if viewed from the correct perspective reveals a hexagram, also known as the Star of David. Now that some boundaries have been defined, relative movements are now possible. The single point of consciousness can now move away from the defined central location, whereas previously there was nothing to move relative to. In the Bible, Eve was supposedly created from Adam's rib. Obviously this has no relevance to the present world, except maybe with unnatural fetus creation techniques. But when this story is compared with the next step in the process, you can begin to appreciate the idea that maybe the Bible is only an exoteric recreation of an older esoteric wisdom. The octahedron is made up of purely straight lines. In sacred geometry, straight lines are considered to be male, and curved lines female. So at this point, what we have is a purely male shape. This is why the Freemasons consider the male to be the generating principle. The next step involves spinning this octahedron in one full rotation around each of the 3 axes defined previously. Again, no mistake can be made. It does not matter which direction it is spun, or in what order the axes are chosen. The end result will always be that the parameters of a perfect sphere have been traced. Now we have a purely female shape. Eve has now been created from Adam. God has now created a perfect spherical membrane, and once again, it only has 2 options available. It can either remain static and explore this imaginary shape for all eternity, or it can repeat the process described thus far. The only difference is now God has a reference point, the spherical membrane, on which to repeat the process. It does not matter where spirit chooses on the membrane to begin the process, as it is a perfect sphere, thus all points are identical to each other. It cannot make a mistake. At this point, God only knows how to do 2 things: projecting an octahedron and creating a spherical membrane, and moving its point of awareness to what is newly created. The next step is described in Genesis in the Bible, and thus the next process is commonly referred to as the Genesis pattern. So God moves to the surface of the newly created spherical membrane and begins projecting another identical sphere. God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light." This has created a very special shape called the Vesica Piscis. This shape can be found twice in your own body: the appearance of the human eye behind the eyelids, and also the lens within the eye, which adjusts the focus of light. The significance of this connection demonstrates both a left brain and a right brain idea, and it certainly shocked me when I was first introduced to it. Once again, God only has 2 options: remain static or project another sphere. To project the 3rd sphere, God moves to what is newly created, which is this circle equator created by the 2 original intersecting spheres. Again, it does not matter where God chooses on this circle as the central point for the third sphere, as all points on this circle are identical. After the third sphere is created, there is only one more rule God follows when creating the rest of the spheres which complete the first stage of this pattern. The rule is, always move to the innermost circle points before projecting another sphere. This results in the process being perfect and prevents a chaotic mess being created. At the creation of each new sphere, more and more patterns or information become available, such as the Vesica Piscis mentioned earlier. The patterns contained within after each new sphere is added is far too extensive to cover in detail. All that remains to be said is after 7 spheres have been created in a vortex-like motion, what we have as a result is known as the seed of life. This basic pattern lays the foundation for the creation of matter and the universe itself. It also gives rise to a shape known as a tube torus if the pattern is spun around the central point. This shape is the only one in existence that can fold upon itself. It is also composed of 7 equal segments which can be displayed visually using the 7 colours of the visible light spectrum. The seed of life is not the complete pattern. There are 2 more steps to take which each reveal yet another layer and also another new set of patterns and information. Following the rule of always move to the innermost points before projecting, God creates an additional 6 circles on top of the existing seed of life pattern. This motion is often referred to as the second vortex motion. This process is repeated once more, the third vortex motion, which finally gives rise to the next new complete pattern known as the flower of life. This pattern is found throughout the ancient world, but the oldest depiction was found at the Temple of Osiris in Egypt, etched into the granite using a process unknown to modern science. Once again, if we proceed through 2 more vortex-like motions, adding additional circles to the flower of life, eventually we reach the next new complete layer, the final layer as far as it is understood, known as the fruit of life. God has now finished creating the pattern which is used as a template for all material things. Remember, this pattern is still purely imaginary, purely consciousness at this point. You may now be starting to comprehend the basis of the idea that we live in a holographic universe. Everything can be reduced to just 2 things, structure and consciousness, although obviously even structure is derived from consciousness. It is a funny feeling knowing that you exist as a creation of consciousness, of God, given how solid and real the physical world appears. In the next video, I will expand upon some of the patterns and information contained within the forms I showed you in this video, and how this fundamental pattern, nature's first pattern, gives rise to matter, and how it is intimately involved with many aspects of the physical world. In the previous video, I showed you how 2 forms, the Vesica Piscis and the torus, could be extrapolated from the patterns formed. I will now show you some more extrapolations, and hopefully it should become clearer to you just how special sacred geometry can be. As before, I am going to be using the 2-dimensional pattern to demonstrate to you various things, as it is far easier to comprehend than a fully 3-dimensional pattern. You must realise, however, that the actual pattern is fully 3-dimensional, and this should become apparent to you shortly when I discuss the Platonic solids. After the tube torus and Vesica Piscis, the next thing that can be demonstrated is known as the tree of life, derived from the seed of life pattern. It is most commonly recognised as a mystical concept within Kabbalah, and is a motif in various world theologies and philosophies. In Kabbalah, it is used as a tool to understand the nature of God and the manner in which he created the world out of nothing. The details of this particular study are too complicated to overview briefly at this point. The next form that can be extrapolated is known as the egg of life. If we proceed to the second vortex motion as described in the previous video, and remove all the circles from the seed of life except this central one, we create this new form consisting of 8 spheres. This form is 3-dimensional, and from our 2-dimensional perspective we are unable to see the 8th sphere, which is located behind this central sphere. This pattern is the most balanced and optimum form for 8 spheres existing in direct connection with each other. The reason why it is called the egg of life is because nature uses this form in the embryonic creation process of every single living organism on this planet, with no exceptions. Nature chooses this form because it is the most balanced, most harmonious form possible. We now proceed to arguably one of the most important set of extrapolations, one which can demonstrate visually as well as mathematically the beauty of sacred geometry. If we take the fruit of life layer defined in the previous video and extract these 13 circles, what we get as a result is known as the holy archetype Metatron's cube. This can be imagined as an extension of the egg of life, as there are 8 spheres in this central portion, but also an additional sphere attached in perfect alignment to the corner of each one of the 8 central spheres. In total, there are 16 spheres in the 3-dimensional version of Metatron's cube. It is interesting to note that the parameters of a hypercube, also known as the terasect, can be extrapolated easily from Metatron's cube, and for this reason literally adds another aspect of dimensionality to this particular form. This arrangement of the spheres is geometrically perfect, so adding or subtracting spheres as previously hinted at with the transformation from the egg of life to Metatron's cube has no impact on the integrity of the geometry itself. For this reason, you should be able to now comprehend the holographic idea as mentioned at the end of the previous video. We have just hinted at a 4th-dimensional concept from a 3-dimensional structure. However, as we cannot directly perceive a 4th dimension, there is little else to mention on this topic at this point. The most widely recognised aspect of Metatron's cube, however, is its relation to the Platonic solids. It should be noted that although Plato's name is attached to these forms, it has been discovered that the late Neolithic people of Scotland had Platonic solid ornaments made of stone 1,000 years prior to Plato. This obviously creates a big question of where they got this wisdom from, but that is for another line of inquiry, another video series. There are 5 Platonic solids: the tetrahedron, the octahedron, the hexahedron, the icosahedron, and the dodecahedron. What makes these shapes so special is that the faces, edges, and angles are all congruent, and that each one can fit perfectly inside a sphere with all the corners touching. There are no other shapes in existence which satisfy these conditions, and that is what makes these shapes so special. These 5 Platonic solids also form pairs, known as duals. The hexahedron and the octahedron make up one pair, and the icosahedron and the dodecahedron make up the other. The tetrahedron is the odd one out, as it is a dual with itself. What this means is that one can be created inside the other, known as nesting, by connecting all the midpoints of all the faces. This process can be repeated to infinity in either direction, and demonstrates very clearly the idea of symmetry in a very unique way. It is also possible to nest each Platonic solid within the other 4 without error, however the symmetry is not as perfect as it is with the duals. So, how do the Platonic solids relate to Metatron's cube? If we take the 2-dimensional form of 13 circles for the sake of simplicity, and using straight lines connect the centre of every circle to the centre of every other circle, we end up with this pattern. What this has created is the parameters for the 2-dimensional flattened versions of the Platonic solids, with the exception of the dodecahedron. The dodecahedron is special in that it requires one to rotate the 3-dimensional version of Metatron's cube by a ratio of phi in order to reveal the missing lines. However, one can add the additional lines on the 2-dimensional version by dividing these sides by the golden ratio, and adding in the extra lines accordingly. It is perhaps for this reason that Plato and Pythagoras shielded others from the dodecahedron, as this particular aspect of wisdom is quite unique, and maybe they felt it would reveal too much if taught. Each Platonic solid is also associated with an element, although these connections I consider to be subjective at this point. The ether, for example, is known to be a formless, omnipresent, immaterial substance, and thus being associated with a geometric shape doesn't quite work. It has been postulated that the dodecahedron is actually associated with the heavens, or cosmos, and interestingly, cosmologists in France and the US suggested that the universe may actually be in the shape of a dodecahedron, based upon their study of the cosmic microwave background radiation. There are some extra shapes which can be extrapolated from the 5 Platonic solids. These are known as the Archimedean solids, of which there are 13 in total. 7 of these can be obtained by truncating one of the Platonic solids. Truncating essentially means cutting off the corners of an existing shape to reveal a new face for the previously existing vertex. 2 of the Archimedean solids can be obtained by the opposite process, expanding the Platonic solid. The final 2 are created by snubbing a Platonic solid, which is done by moving the faces outward whilst twisting. These shapes and the processes just described require more explanation, but I do not have enough time in this video to do so. I have saved this final extrapolation for last because it will lead on to the next chapter in this video series. It is known as the divine proportion, or the golden ratio, and like the mathematical value of pi is an irrational number, this means the exact value can never be fully determined, as the creation of this number results in an infinite series of non-repetitive digits. The most simple way to demonstrate the golden ratio is to use the Vesica-Piscis layer of nature's first pattern, although there are many other opportunities to demonstrate it, such as with the Platonic solids. I will now show you the process of calculating the golden ratio from the beginning. We start with a single length with a value of 1, and using this as the radius, we trace a circle. The diameter of the circle obviously has a value of 2. The next step is to simply create another circle of identical size with its central points located anywhere on the circle defined previously. This creates the Vesica-Piscis shape as explained in the previous video. If we add in some guidelines, the rest of this calculation should be very easy to comprehend. We can now construct a simple right-angled triangle using the values of 1 and 2, 1 for the height and 2 for the width. The hypotenuse length can be calculated using trigonometry. Using this length, which has a value of 0.5, we rotate it around this point to trace another circle. Where this circle intersects the hypotenuse, we have the final parameter for the golden ratio, which is this newly created length along the hypotenuse. We have now successfully demonstrated this geometric relationship, known as the golden ratio, and have an approximate number of 1.618 as its value. This can also be used to construct what is known as the golden spiral, and is most commonly recognized in the Nautilus shell. The golden spiral can be approximated using a series of numbers known as the Fibonacci series. This relationship is an aspect I will be mentioning in the next video, where I will show you sacred geometry in the biological world and how nature utilizes these forms and principles to give rise to the symphony of life we see all around us.